In this episode, we bring the whole story together by looking at how development governance and deployment governance can be combined into one decision-making framework that an organization can actually defend. For a brand new learner, that phrase may sound formal, but the idea underneath it is straightforward. A system should not be governed one way while it is being built and then governed by a completely different logic once it is released into the world. If that happens, important lessons get lost, responsibilities become blurry, and leaders may approve something at deployment without fully understanding the risks, limits, and assumptions that were visible earlier in development. The goal here is to build one connected way of deciding, documenting, escalating, and reviewing AIUs from the first idea all the way through live operation. When those pieces are connected, the organization makes better choices, catches problems earlier, and can explain later why it moved forward, why it paused, or why it changed course when the evidence demanded it. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful starting point is understanding why synthesis matters at all. Many organizations separate development and deployment in a way that feels convenient but creates weak governance. One team studies impact, data, and design while the system is being built, and then another team focuses on rollout, monitoring, training, and contracts once the system is ready to launch. That division may sound efficient, but it often breaks the chain of reasoning that should connect the full life of the system. The people making the deployment decision may see a polished product and a strong business case, but not the early assumptions, unresolved issues, or narrow conditions that originally made the project acceptable. For a beginner, the first big lesson is that governance should follow the system, not just the department. If the same AI capability moves from design to testing to deployment to live use, then the evidence, concerns, limits, and responsibilities attached to that capability should move with it, so that later decisions are grounded in the full story rather than only in the final presentation. To build one unified framework, the organization first needs to understand what a defensible decision actually means. A defensible decision is not a perfect decision, and it is not a decision that guarantees nothing bad will happen. It is a decision that can be explained clearly using evidence, reasoning, documented trade-offs, and visible accountability. If a leader approves a system for deployment, that approval should rest on more than enthusiasm, vendor promises, or pressure to move quickly. It should rest on a record showing what problem the system addresses, what value it is expected to create, what risks were identified, what safeguards were required, what limits remain, and who accepted the remaining uncertainty. For a beginner, this is important because governance is not really about preventing all future criticism. It is about making choices that a reasonable person could look at later and say the organization had a serious process, used relevant evidence, and did not simply wave the system into production because the technology seemed exciting or the timeline felt urgent. A unified decision-making framework usually begins with purpose and context because those two elements shape everything that follows. The organization should be able to explain what task the system is meant to support, why AI is being considered for that task, and what makes the surrounding environment sensitive or not sensitive. A narrow internal drafting tool and a system that influences access to jobs, benefits, healthcare, or services do not belong in the same risk conversation, even if both use similar underlying technology. The framework should therefore force early clarity about the seriousness of the use case, the people who may be affected, the kind of decisions the system will influence, and whether errors are easy to correct or hard to reverse. For a beginner, this step matters because it prevents later confusion. When purpose and context are poorly defined, the project drifts. When they are clearly stated at the start, the rest of the governance process has a stable reference point for judging data choices, model choices, controls, monitoring expectations, and whether the system is still operating within the conditions that originally made it acceptable. From there, the framework should connect impact assessment during development with impact review before deployment, so that these are not treated as separate universes. Early in the project, The organization may ask broad questions about who could be affected, what harms could arise, what fairness and transparency concerns exist, and whether the use case appears suitable for further work. Later, when a specific system has been selected, those same questions should be asked again in a narrower and more concrete way. The later review should not start from zero. It should build on the earlier analysis and ask whether the chosen system still fits the purpose, risk level, and human environment originally described. For a beginner, this is one of the clearest ways to see what synthesis looks like in practice. The early assessment creates the first map of concern. The later review tests whether the actual system still fits that map or whether something about the design, data, workflow, or business ambition has changed enough that the project now deserves stronger conditions, narrower scope, or a completely different decision than leaders would have made at the concept stage. Data, model, and architecture decisions should also be brought into the same framework rather than handled as purely technical choices. During development, teams need to study what data is available, how representative it is, what quality issues it contains, what permissions and obligations attach to it, and whether the model type and deployment architecture fit the real task rather than just a fashionable idea of what advanced AI looks like. At deployment, those same questions continue in a different form. The organization now has to ask whether production data will resemble evaluation data closely enough, whether the model and architecture remain proportionate to the stakes of the workflow, and whether the data paths and connected systems can be monitored and controlled over time. For a beginner, the lesson is that technical design is never just technical. A predictive model, a large language model, LLM, a cloud deployment, a retrieval-augmented generation, RAG, workflow, or an agentic setup each creates a different governance burden. A unified framework makes sure those choices are judged not only by capability, but also by explainability, data sensitivity, update risk, maintenance burden, and the organization's real ability to supervise the system after it goes live. The same kind of synthesis should apply to vendors, contracts, and external dependencies. Development teams may become excited about proprietary tools because they offer fast results, polished interfaces, or advanced capabilities, but the framework should carry vendor review all the way into the deployment decision instead of treating contracts as the final paperwork step. If the organization depends on a vendor-controlled model or platform, then the decision framework should include licensing limits, data handling terms, intellectual property conditions, service commitments, change management rights, security obligations, and exit planning as part of the evidence base for deciding whether the system belongs in production. For a beginner, this matters because governance is not limited to the internal qualities of the model. It also includes the strength of the relationship behind the model. A deployment may look impressive and still be weakly governed if the organization lacks sufficient control over retention, notice of changes, incident response visibility, or the ability to unwind the relationship when conditions no longer support continued use. One defensible framework keeps those external dependencies visible instead of letting them slip outside the core approval logic. Workforce readiness and human oversight should also be woven through both development and deployment decisions rather than being considered only at the end. During development, teams should already be asking who will use the system, who will review its outputs, what level of understanding those people will have, and whether the human role around the system is realistic under ordinary working conditions. At deployment, that analysis needs to become more concrete. The organization should know what users are trained to do, when they are expected to challenge outputs, how they escalate issues, and whether they have enough time and authority to exercise judgment instead of simply rubber-stamping machine recommendations. For a beginner, this is a central governance point because many systems fail less from technical collapse than from over-reliance, workload pressure, and vague review roles. A unified framework keeps asking the same essential question as the project matures. Are the humans around this AI genuinely prepared to keep it within defensible boundaries? Or is the organization merely claiming human oversight while creating conditions where meaningful oversight is unlikely to survive normal operational pressure? Good frameworks also connect control design before release with control operation after release. Before deployment, the organization should define data controls, risk thresholds, issue management paths, user guidance, communication responsibilities, deactivation options, and localization boundaries. After deployment, those should not remain abstract promises. They should become real operating practices that are reviewed, tested, and adjusted as evidence accumulates. In a unified framework, the same control that justified approval becomes the control that must later prove it is working. If human review was cited as a safeguard, the organization should later verify whether users are actually reviewing. If narrow scope was cited as a reason the system was acceptable, monitoring should later check whether the scope has quietly expanded. For a beginner, this makes governance feel much more concrete. Controls are not ornaments attached to a business case. They are living commitments. One defensible framework therefore links approval conditions to operational verification so the organization can see whether the real world still matches the assumptions that supported the original decision to move forward. Decision points should be organized as stage gates, but those gates should be connected by evidence rather than treated as unrelated checkpoints. At the concept stage, the framework may ask whether the use case deserves exploration. At the build stage, it may ask whether data, design, and evaluation support continued investment. At the pre-deployment stage, it may ask whether the selected system is appropriate for live use under defined controls. After deployment, it may ask whether monitoring, incidents, red teaming, audits, and security testing still support continued operation. For a beginner, the most important thing to notice is that each gate should look backward and forward at the same time. It should look backward to the earlier assumptions and commitments that shaped the project, and it should look forward to the conditions that must hold for the next stage to remain acceptable. This creates continuity. Instead of a project changing hands and shedding its history at every transition, the framework makes each new decision part of a chain, which helps leaders see not just whether the system is impressive today, but whether it still fits the logic that justified it yesterday. Documentation is the thread that holds this full framework together. Without strong records, the organization cannot carry evidence from development into deployment, cannot explain why specific limits were attached to approval, and cannot learn properly when post-release behavior reveals something new. Good documentation should preserve the purpose of the system, the impact analysis, data concerns, design choices, evaluation results, vendor considerations, training expectations, control commitments, approval conditions, monitoring findings, incident records, update history, and decisions to narrow, pause, or extend use over time. For a beginner, the key lesson is that documentation is not a bureaucratic side effect. It is the memory of governance. A defensible framework depends on institutional memory because real systems evolve, teams change, leaders move on, and business pressure can easily erase earlier caution if the reasons behind that caution were never captured in a form that others can revisit. Strong documentation allows later reviewers to see why the system was approved, what conditions mattered then, and whether the real deployment still lives within those conditions now. Roles and decision rights also need to be clear across the full framework, because a system cannot be governed well if people do not know who owns which judgment. Technical teams may own evaluation details. Product leaders may own the business purpose. Risk, legal, privacy, security, and compliance teams may each own different categories of obligation and exposure. Operations may understand how the tool behaves under real workload. Senior leadership may own the decision to accept residual risk. In a unified framework, these roles should not disappear and reappear unpredictably at different stages. They should be mapped clearly so that everyone knows when they are advisory, when they are accountable, and when they have authority to stop, narrow, or escalate a deployment. For a beginner, this matters because weak governance often looks like confusion more than malice. People assume someone else is responsible, or they think a concern has already been reviewed by another team, and the system moves forward without anyone fully owning the hard judgment. A defensible framework reduces that risk by making decision rights visible and consistent from concept to live operation. One of the most important features of a synthesized framework is feedback from deployment back into development. Once a system is live, the organization begins learning things that no design review can fully predict. Monitoring may reveal drift, user confusion, or weak adoption patterns. Incident analysis may show that certain data gaps or brittle behaviors matter more than expected. Red teaming and audits may uncover weaknesses in controls, scope management, or human oversight. In a weak organization, those lessons stay local to the live system and are handled only as isolated fixes. In a stronger organization, they flow backward into how future systems are designed, assessed, contracted, trained, and approved. For a beginner, this feedback loop is one of the clearest signs of maturity. Governance is not just a path from idea to launch. It is a learning system. The same evidence that helps improve one deployment should also improve the next concept review, the next impact assessment, the next contract negotiation, and the next set of training expectations so that the organization becomes less easy to surprise over time. A unified framework must also be built to handle uncertainty honestly. Not every decision will be a clean yes or no. Sometimes the right answer will be a conditional approval, a pilot, a narrow deployment, stronger monitoring, more training, limited geography, or exclusion of high-risk use cases until better evidence exists. Sometimes the correct answer will be not yet, even when the technology looks promising. A defensible framework should give leaders room to make those nuanced decisions without treating caution as failure or speed as the default sign of progress. For a beginner, this is a deeply important point because many governance problems arise when organizations feel they must either embrace the system fully or reject it completely. Real-world governance is often smarter than that. It uses conditions, staging, localization, deactivation controls, review triggers, and explicit limits to shape how the system enters the world. That kind of proportionality is one of the strongest signs that the organization is not simply chasing capability, but actively governing how much trust the system is allowed to hold and under what circumstances that trust should shrink or expand. A practical example can help pull all of this together. Imagine an organization wants to deploy an AI assistant to help staff respond to internal policy questions and later, possibly, external customer inquiries. Under one unified framework, the project would begin with a purpose and impact assessment that asks whether the use case is appropriate, what data is involved, and who could be affected if the system is wrong. During development, the organization would study the knowledge sources, select an architecture, evaluate the model, review vendor terms if a proprietary service is used, and define user guidance and controls. Before deployment, it would conduct a focused review of the selected system, check workforce readiness, confirm monitoring and issue paths, and decide whether customer-facing use should be excluded initially. After release, it would monitor output quality, document incidents, verify controls through audits and testing, and use findings to decide whether the system should stay narrow, expand, or be corrected. For a beginner, the power of this example is that every decision connects to the next one. Nothing important gets forgotten just because the project moved from one stage to another. As we close, the central lesson is that development governance and deployment governance should not be treated as separate conversations with separate memories and separate logic. They should be synthesized into one defensible decision-making framework that follows the AI system from idea to design to approval to live operation and, when necessary, to narrowing, suspension, or retirement. That framework begins with purpose and context, grows through impact assessment, data and model review, vendor and workforce evaluation, and then continues through deployment controls, monitoring, incident handling, communication, and post-release verification. For a new learner, the most important takeaway is that good governance is not a pile of disconnected reviews. It is a chain of reasoning supported by evidence, documentation, accountability, and feedback. When that chain is strong, the organization can explain why it built the system, why it deployed it, how it kept it under control, and why its decisions were responsible even when uncertainty remained. That is what makes the framework defensible, and that is what turns governance from theory into practice.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.